The morning sun painted golden streaks across the windows of Wright's barbershop as Pamela Wright unlocked the front door. At 34, she had the steady hands of someone who had spent years perfecting precision work, though most people in Millbrook assumed those skills came only from cutting hair. The small town of Millbrook sat nestled between rolling hills and farmland, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Pamela had been running her barbershop here for 3 years, and in that time, she had become as much a fixture as the old water tower that stood watch over Main Street. Her shop was simple but clean. 2 vintage barber chairs faced a wall of mirrors, and shelves lined with traditional tools gave the place an old-world charm. The black and white checkered floor tiles were original from the 1950s, carefully preserved and polished to a shine that reflected the afternoon light. Antique shaving mugs lined one shelf, while another displayed a collection of straight razors that Pamela had restored to working condition. The locals appreciated her attention to detail and her fair prices. She was known for listening more than talking, which made her popular with customers who needed someone to hear their troubles. What they didn't know was that before she had arrived in Millbrook, Pamela Wright had been Dr. Pamela Wright, a chemical engineer with a PhD from MIT. She had spent 8 years working for major corporations, designing industrial processes and solving complex chemical problems. Her dissertation on thermal runaway prevention in industrial chemical reactions had been cited in over 200 academic papers. She had held patents on 3 different safety monitoring systems and had consulted for companies across 4 continents. But corporate life had burned her out. The politics, the pressure, the endless meetings about meetings had drained her spirit. She had watched as cost-cutting measures override safety recommendations, seen good ideas buried in bureaucracy, and witnessed too many decisions made by people who prioritized quarterly profits over long-term sustainability or worker safety. The final straw had come during her last project, designing a new chemical processing facility for a major petrochemical company. Despite her recommendations for enhanced safety systems, the company had chosen cheaper alternatives that met minimum regulatory requirements but provided no margin for error. When she expressed concerns about potential failure modes, she was told that her job was to design systems, not to question business decisions. 6 months after the facility opened, exactly the type of incident she had warned about occurred. While no one was seriously injured, the close call haunted her. She realized that her expertise was being used to provide a veneer of legitimacy for decisions made by people who didn't understand the technical risks involved. When her grandfather passed away and left her his small house in Millbrook, Pamela saw it as a chance to start over. She sold her city apartment, packed her belongings, and bought the empty storefront on Main Street. Learning to cut hair had been surprisingly enjoyable, and she found peace in the simple rhythm of the work. The transition hadn't been easy. She had spent months learning the fundamentals of barbering, practicing on willing friends and taking classes at a cosmetology school in the nearest city. Her scientific background had actually helped. She approached hair cutting with the same methodical precision she had once applied to chemical processes, studying the structure of hair, the geometry of cuts, and the physics of how different techniques achieved different results. Her first customers had been patient with her learning curve, and gradually word spread about the new barber who took unusual care with details and never seemed to be in a hurry. She developed a reputation for being able to fix haircuts that other stylists had botched, approaching each problem like a puzzle to be solved rather than a routine task to be completed quickly. The bell above her door chimed as Tom Rodriguez entered, her first customer of the day. Tom owned the hardware store next door and had become something of a friend over the years. He was in his 50s, with calloused hands that spoke of decades of physical work, and a genuine smile that made customers feel welcome in his store. "Morning, Pamela," Tom said, settling into the barber chair. The usual trim, please. Of course, Pamela replied, draping the cape around his shoulders. How's business? Tom's reflection in the mirror showed a worried expression. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Have you heard about the new management company that bought the Peterson chemical plant? Pamela's hands paused for just a moment before continuing to work. The Peterson plant sat on the edge of town, producing industrial chemicals for agriculture. It had been family-owned for 40 years, but financial troubles had forced them to sell to a larger corporation. The Peterson family had been known for their conservative approach to operations, prioritizing safety and community relations over maximum profitability. I heard something about it, she said carefully. New owners? New everything, Tom said. Management, procedures, staff. Word is they're cutting costs wherever they can. Some of the old workers are worried about safety protocols being relaxed. My cousin Jake worked there for 15 years, and he says they've eliminated most of the redundant safety systems, called them unnecessary overhead. Pamela nodded, focusing on his haircut while her mind processed this information. She knew enough about chemical plants to understand that redundant safety systems weren't overhead. They were the difference between a manageable incident and a catastrophic disaster. Chemical processes operated under conditions of temperature and pressure that could become dangerous very quickly if not properly monitored and controlled. I'm sure they have regulations they need to follow, she said, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. That's what everyone hopes, Tom replied. But Jake says the new managers keep talking about optimizing efficiency and eliminating wasteful practices. Sounds like corporate speak for cutting corners to me. The conversation was interrupted when the door chimed again, but instead of another customer, a man in an expensive suit walked in. He was tall, probably in his 40s, with perfectly styled hair and a watch that cost more than most people in Millbrook made in a month. His shoes were Italian leather, recently polished, and his tie probably cost more than Pamela charged for a month's worth of haircuts. He looked around the shop with the air of someone examining a curiosity, taking in the vintage fixtures and small-town atmosphere with barely concealed amusement. "Excuse me," the man said, looking around the shop with barely concealed disdain. "I'm looking for someone who can give me directions to the Peterson chemical facility." "I can help you," Tom offered, starting to turn in the barber chair. "It's about 2 miles east of town. Just follow Industrial Road past the grain elevator and—" "I wasn't talking to you," the man interrupted coldly, his tone suggesting that he considered Tom's offer presumptuous. "I need to speak with someone who actually knows the area professionally, someone with authority." The dismissal was casual but cutting, delivered with the unconscious arrogance of someone who had never doubted his right to speak while expecting others to listen. Pamela set down her scissors and turned to face the stranger, her movements deliberate and controlled. She had encountered this type before in corporate settings, people who equated expensive clothes with competence and assumed that anyone working with their hands must be intellectually inferior. "I know the area well," she said calmly. "The plant is on Industrial Road, about 2 miles past the grain elevator. You can't miss it. There's a large sign at the entrance, and the building is visible from the road." The man looked her up and down, taking in her work clothes and the barbershop setting. His expression shifted from dismissive to patronizing, as if he were dealing with a child who had tried to join an adult conversation. "You're just a hairdresser," he said dismissively, the word just carrying particular emphasis. "I need real directions from someone with actual authority in this town, someone who understands industrial operations." Tom's face reddened at the insult, but Pamela placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, silently asking him to let her handle this. She had dealt with this type of arrogance many times in her previous career and had learned that responding with anger only reinforced their assumptions about her competence. "Sir, I've lived in this area for 3 years and I know every road, she replied evenly. The directions I gave you are accurate and will get you to the Peterson plant efficiently. Look, sweetheart, the man said with a condescending smile that never reached his eyes. I'm David Morrison, the new operations manager for Peterson Chemical. I don't have time for directions from the local beauty parlor. Is there a mayor or sheriff I can speak with? Someone who actually understands how industrial facilities operate? The casual use of sweetheart was clearly intended to diminish her, to reduce her from a person offering help to a stereotype to be dismissed. Pamela recognized the tactic and refused to be baited by it. The sheriff's office is 3 blocks down Main Street, Pamela replied, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious insult. But the directions to the plant won't change regardless of who gives them to you. Morrison laughed, a sound that held no warmth and conveyed his amusement at what he saw as small-town simplicity. I'm sure you mean well, but I need to speak with people who understand industrial operations, not someone who spends their day cutting hair. This is serious business, not small-town gossip. The implication was clear. He considered her work trivial and her knowledge irrelevant. It was exactly the kind of attitude that had driven Pamela away from corporate life, the assumption that a person's value could be measured by their job title rather than their actual knowledge or capabilities. After Morrison left, the tension in the shop was palpable. Tom shook his head in disgust, his anger evident in his clenched jaw and tight shoulders. "What an arrogant jerk," Tom said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Who does he think he is, talking to you like that?" Pamela resumed cutting his hair, but her movements were more precise now, almost mechanical. She had learned to channel her emotions into focused work, a skill that served her well in both her current and former careers. "Someone who judges people by their current job instead of their capabilities," she said quietly. "Someone who confuses authority with competence." "You handled that better than I would have," Tom said. "I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of his attitude." "People like that aren't usually interested in hearing what others think," Pamela replied. "They've already decided what everyone else is worth." Over the next few weeks, Morrison's presence in Millbrook became increasingly felt. He made changes at the plant quickly and decisively, often without consulting the local workers who had decades of experience. Word spread through the tight-knit community about his management style, dismissive of local knowledge, focused solely on cost reduction, and impatient with what he called small-town inefficiencies. The townspeople began to whisper about increased truck traffic carrying chemical supplies, strange odors coming from the facility during certain weather conditions, and reports that safety meetings had been canceled to increase productivity. Workers who had been with the company for years found themselves subjected to new policies that prioritized speed over caution. Jake Rodriguez, Tom's cousin, stopped by the barber shop one afternoon looking haggard and worried. He had worked at the Peterson plant for 15 years and had never seen morale so low. "They've cut the maintenance staff by half," he told Pamela as she trimmed his hair. "Morrison says the old safety protocols were excessive and that modern equipment doesn't need as much monitoring. But I've been around chemical processing long enough to know that cutting corners on safety is like playing Russian roulette." Pamela listened carefully, her scientific background allowing her to understand the implications of what Jake was describing. Reduced maintenance meant increased risk of equipment failure. Elimination of safety protocols meant that small problems could cascade into major disasters before anyone noticed. "Have you tried talking to Morrison about your concerns?" she asked. Jake laughed bitterly. "I tried once. He told me that my job was to follow procedures, not to question decisions made by people with MBAs. Said that 30 years of experience in small-town operations didn't qualify me to understand modern industrial management. Morrison himself became a regular sight on Main Street, usually accompanied by other executives from the parent company. He had a habit of making loud comments about the simple folk of Millbrook and their limited understanding of modern business practices. His expensive suits and imported car stood out sharply against the practical clothing and modest vehicles favored by most residents. During one particularly unpleasant encounter at Ruby's Diner, Morrison had loudly declared that small-town people needed to know their place and leave important decisions to people with real education and experience. Several local business owners had been present, including Tom Rodriguez and Martha Stevens, who ran the town's small library. "These people think they understand chemistry because they can read the label on a bottle of bleach," Morrison had said to his companions, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "It's almost charming how simple they are. They probably think mixing baking soda and vinegar is advanced science." The comment had been met with uncomfortable silence from the other diners, many of whom had college degrees and professional experience in their own fields. Martha Stevens, who held a master's degree in library science and had worked as a research specialist before moving to Millbrook, exchanged glances with Tom Rodriguez, who had served as a military engineer before taking over his family's hardware business. Pamela had been having lunch at a corner table when this happened. She watched Morrison's performance with growing concern, not just because of his insults, but because of what his attitude suggested about his approach to plant safety. Someone who dismissed local knowledge so casually was unlikely to listen to warnings from workers who understood the practical realities of chemical processing. She found herself studying Morrison whenever their paths crossed, noting details that her scientific training had taught her to observe. He often had faint chemical odors on his clothing that suggested he was spending time in active processing areas without proper protective equipment. His shoes sometimes showed traces of chemical residue that indicated contamination protocols weren't being followed. Most concerning, he displayed the overconfidence of someone who believed his theoretical knowledge was sufficient without practical experience. The next morning, Pamela was opening her shop when she noticed something that made her stop cold. A faint chemical smell hung in the air, something that shouldn't be detectable from the town center. Her trained nose immediately began analyzing the components: hydrogen sulfide, benzene compounds, possibly chlorinated solvents. The combination suggested that multiple chemical processes were operating simultaneously, possibly without proper isolation. She stood still for several minutes, letting the morning air carry different scents to her. The chemical odors were faint but persistent, and they included compounds that should never be released into the atmosphere under normal operating conditions. Her scientific training kicked in automatically, cataloging the different chemicals and considering what their presence in the air might indicate about the plant's operations. She called the plant's main number and asked to speak with the safety officer. "We don't have a dedicated safety officer anymore," the receptionist told her cheerfully. "All safety concerns go through Mr. Morrison's office now. He streamlined the management structure to eliminate redundancies. Can I take a message?" The elimination of a dedicated safety officer was another red flag. Chemical plants required constant monitoring by someone whose sole focus was identifying and preventing safety hazards. Combining safety oversight with operational management created conflicts of interest that could lead to dangerous compromises. "Yes," Pamela said. "Please tell Mr. Morrison that there are chemical odors detectable in town, and he should check his emission controls and ventilation systems immediately." "And you are?" "Pamela Wright. I run Wright's Barber Shop on Main Street." 2 hours later, Morrison himself showed up at her barber shop, his face red with anger and his expensive suit slightly wrinkled from what looked like a hurried trip to the plant. "Did you call my plant with some ridiculous complaint about smells?" he demanded, not bothering with basic politeness. Several customers in the shop turned to watch the confrontation, sensing drama in Morrison's aggressive tone and defensive posture. I called to report what could be a safety concern, Pamela replied calmly, not pausing in her work on current customers' hair. There are chemical odors that shouldn't be detectable this far from the facility. Morrison laughed harshly, the sound carrying a note of hysteria that suggested he was under more pressure than he wanted to admit. Lady, you cut hair for a living. You wouldn't know a chemical odor from cheap perfume. Stop trying to interfere with operations you don't understand. I understand more than you might think, Pamela said quietly, her hands continuing their steady work despite the confrontation. Really? Morrison's voice dripped with sarcasm. Did you take a chemistry class in high school? Maybe watched some YouTube videos about science? Leave the real work to the professionals who actually know what they're doing. The dismissal was so complete, so contemptuous, that even Morrison's tone suggested he considered the conversation beneath his dignity. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. And don't waste my time with any more amateur chemical analysis, he added. I have real problems to solve, not imaginary concerns from people who think they understand industrial chemistry. After he left, the shop was quiet, except for the soft snip of scissors and the hum of the air conditioning. Pamela's current customer, an elderly farmer named William Hayes, spoke up. That man's got a lot of anger for someone who's supposed to be solving problems, William observed. Makes me wonder what kind of problems he's really dealing with. Over the following days, the chemical odors became stronger and more frequent. Pamela noticed patterns that troubled her deeply. The smells were strongest during shift changes, suggesting that safety protocols weren't being followed during personnel transitions. The composition of the odors indicated that multiple chemical processes were running simultaneously without proper separation, a dangerous practice that could lead to unexpected reactions. The wind patterns also concerned her. When the breeze came from the southeast, where the plant was located, the chemical odors were most noticeable. But they were also detectable during periods of calm air, which suggested that the emissions were continuous rather than occasional. Continuous low-level emissions often indicated that containment systems were failing gradually, a situation that could lead to sudden catastrophic failure. She tried calling the plant again, but her calls were no longer put through to Morrison. The receptionist politely explained that Mr. Morrison was very busy with operational improvements, and that safety concerns should be submitted in writing through the proper channels. When she mentioned her concerns to other townspeople, most dismissed them politely, assuming that someone with a chemistry background would have already noticed any real problems. The assumption that experts were already handling the situation was both comforting and dangerous. It prevented people from taking independent action when the experts might be part of the problem. Tom Rodriguez was one of the few who took her seriously. You really think there's something wrong at the plant? I think there are warning signs that shouldn't be ignored, Pamela said during one of his regular haircuts. But I'm just a barber, according to Mr. Morrison. Maybe, Tom said thoughtfully. But you're a barber who notices things other people miss? That's got to count for something. Martha Stevens, the librarian, had also begun to notice changes in the community's atmosphere. People were more anxious, more willing to discuss their concerns in whispered conversations. Several parents had mentioned that their children were experiencing more respiratory problems than usual, particularly those who played outside during certain times of day. There's something in the air, Martha told Pamela during a visit to the barber shop. Not just chemicals, but worry. People are starting to feel like something's wrong, even if they can't put their finger on what it is. The crisis began on a Thursday morning in October. Pamela was cutting the hair of elderly Mrs. Patterson when she heard the explosion. It wasn't loud enough to break windows, but it was definitely coming from the direction of the chemical plant. The sound had a particular quality that her experience told her indicated a pressure vessel failure rather than a simple mechanical breakdown. Within minutes, her phone started ringing. Tom Rodriguez was calling from his hardware store, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Pamela, there's smoke coming from the plant, and people are saying there was some kind of accident. The fire department is on their way, but they're asking about chemical hazards, and nobody knows what to tell them." The rest of his words were cut off by the town's emergency siren, a sound that hadn't been heard in Millbrook for over a decade. The wailing tone immediately sent chills through everyone who heard it, a primitive alarm that spoke of danger beyond the ordinary emergencies of small-town life. Pamela looked out her window and saw smoke rising from the direction of the plant. But what worried her more was the color of the smoke, a yellowish-green tint that suggested chlorine gas was being released. Chlorine gas was heavier than air, which meant it would settle in low-lying areas and could affect the entire town if wind conditions were wrong. Mrs. Patterson noticed her expression and the way Pamela had suddenly stopped cutting her hair. "What's wrong, dear?" "I need you to leave immediately," Pamela said, removing the cape from around the elderly woman's shoulders with gentle urgency. "Go home, close all your windows, and stay inside until the all-clear is given. If you have air conditioning, turn it to recirculate mode so it doesn't bring in outside air." "But my hair isn't finished." "Your hair is fine, Mrs. Patterson. Please just go home and stay inside. This is very important." The urgency in Pamela's voice convinced the elderly woman to leave quickly. As soon as she was gone, Pamela locked her shop and ran toward the plant. She could already see people evacuating the facility, many of them coughing and covering their faces with whatever fabric they could find. The scene at the plant was chaos. Emergency vehicles were arriving, but she could tell from the confusion and disorganization that no one fully understood what they were dealing with. Firefighters were keeping their distance from the main building, clearly uncertain about the nature of the chemical hazard they faced. The plant's parking lot was filled with workers who had fled the building, some supporting colleagues who were having trouble breathing. The yellowish smoke was billowing from several points on the building, suggesting that the incident had affected multiple systems. Pamela spotted Morrison near the main building, shouting into his phone while his shirt and suit jacket showed obvious signs of chemical exposure. Yellow staining on his clothes confirmed her suspicions about chlorine gas, and the pattern of staining suggested he had been inside the building when the release occurred. She approached him, noting additional details that her training had taught her to observe. His skin showed signs of chemical irritation, and he was breathing more rapidly than normal, suggesting possible inhalation exposure. Most concerning, he appeared disoriented and panicked, not the controlled response she would expect from someone trained in emergency management. "What happened?" she asked, having to raise her voice over the sound of sirens and shouting. Morrison looked up, his face flushed with panic and anger. Sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool October air, and his hands were shaking slightly. "Some kind of equipment failure," he said, his voice hoarse from chemical exposure. "The cooling system went down and temperatures spiked in the reaction chamber. We've got gas venting that we can't stop, and the backup systems aren't responding." "What chemicals are involved?" "I don't have time for questions from—" Morrison stopped mid-sentence as another wave of yellowish smoke billowed from the building behind him, accompanied by a hissing sound that suggested pressurized gas escaping. "We need real help, not local busybodies asking stupid questions." Pamela looked around at the emergency responders who were keeping their distance from the building, clearly unsure about the nature of the chemical hazard. The fire chief was on his radio, probably trying to reach hazmat specialists who were hours away. In the meantime, the gas release was continuing, and wind conditions could change at any moment. She could see that the emergency responders were professional and competent, but they lacked the specific knowledge needed to understand what they were dealing with. Treating this as a standard hazmat incident could lead to ineffective responses that allowed the situation to worsen. "Mr. Morrison," she said, stepping closer and speaking in the firm tone she had once used in corporate crisis situations, "I need you to listen carefully. What you have is a chlorine gas release, possibly combined with other compounds. The yellow color and the odor pattern indicate that your chlorination process has gone thermal. If this continues, it will create hydrochloric acid vapor that can cause permanent lung damage to anyone in the area." Morrison stared at her in shock, his panic-induced tunnel vision suddenly broken by the specificity and accuracy of her assessment. "How do you... What's the temperature in the reaction chamber right now?" she interrupted, knowing that time was critical. The gauges are reading 200 degrees Celsius, but that can't be right. The normal operating temperature is 80 degrees. "It's probably accurate," Pamela said grimly. "At that temperature, your chlorinated compounds are decomposing and creating toxic byproducts. You need to flood the system with sodium bicarbonate solution to neutralize the acid formation, and you need to do it now before the temperature climbs high enough to cause structural failure." "You're a barber," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with stress and disbelief. "You don't know what you're talking about." Another wave of gas vented from the building, this time accompanied by what sounded like metal under stress. Pamela realized they had minutes before the situation became truly catastrophic. The structural integrity of the reaction chamber was being compromised by the extreme temperature, and failure would release massive quantities of toxic gas into the atmosphere. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had developed during years of managing industrial crises, "I have a PhD in chemical engineering from MIT. I spent 8 years designing industrial chemical processes and safety systems before I came to Millbrook. Right now, I'm the most qualified person on this site to help you prevent a disaster that could kill hundreds of people." Morrison's face went white as the implications sank in. All his assumptions about small-town competence, all his dismissive comments about local knowledge, suddenly seemed not just wrong, but potentially catastrophic. That's impossible," he stammered. "The reaction chamber is going to rupture if you don't neutralize the thermal runaway immediately," Pamela continued, her scientific training taking over as she analyzed the situation. "Do you have sodium bicarbonate on site?" Yes, in the emergency supply room." "Where's the injection port for the chamber?" Morrison pointed toward a control panel near the building with shaking hands. "Over there, but the area is not safe." "It's safer than letting this continue," Pamela said firmly. She turned to the fire chief, who had been listening to their conversation with growing amazement. "Chief, I need your people to clear everyone back another 100 yards. This facility needs to be evacuated completely until we can stabilize the reaction." The fire chief, a veteran of 30 years who had seen his share of emergencies, looked from Pamela to Morrison, clearly uncertain about taking orders from a local barber. But something in her tone and the specificity of her knowledge convinced him that she knew what she was talking about. "She knows what she's talking about," Morrison said quietly, his corporate arrogance finally broken by the reality of the crisis. "Do what she says." Chief Williams began barking orders to his crew, establishing a wider perimeter and preparing for possible evacuation of nearby residential areas. The professionalism of the emergency response was impressive, but everyone understood that they were dealing with something beyond their normal training. Pamela borrowed protective gear from one of the fire trucks and approached the control panel. The readings confirmed her worst fears. The temperature was climbing rapidly, and pressure was building in the reaction chamber beyond safe limits. She calculated quickly in her head. They had perhaps 10 minutes before the containment would fail completely, releasing massive quantities of toxic gas into the atmosphere. Working with precise movements learned from years of laboratory experience, she began the neutralization process. The sodium bicarbonate solution had to be introduced gradually to avoid thermal shock that could cause an explosive pressure release. Too fast, and the rapid cooling could cause the chamber to crack. Too slow, and the continuing temperature rise would lead to catastrophic failure. As she worked, she explained the process to Morrison and the emergency responders who were watching from a safe distance, her voice calm and professional, despite the life-or-death nature of the situation. The chlorine gas is being produced by thermal decomposition of chlorinated compounds, she said, adjusting flow rates on the control panel with the precision of someone who had done similar work hundreds of times. When chlorine gas contacts moisture in the air, it forms hydrochloric acid. That's what's causing the respiratory distress in the workers who were exposed. How do you know all this? Morrison asked, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Because this is exactly the kind of scenario we planned for when I designed chemical safety systems for DuPont, Pamela replied, monitoring the pressure readings while making minute adjustments to the neutralization flow. The thermal runaway you're experiencing is a classic result of inadequate cooling and improper temperature monitoring. She continued working, her movements economical and confident, despite the dangerous environment. The protective gear was uncomfortable and limited her vision, but her hands moved with muscle memory developed through years of working with complex chemical systems. The key, she explained while adjusting another valve, is to introduce the neutralizing agent gradually. If we flood the system too quickly, the rapid temperature change could cause thermal shock and crack the containment vessel. If we go too slowly, the temperature will continue to rise until we reach the failure point. Gradually, the readings began to stabilize. The temperature in the reaction chamber started to drop, and the pressure decreased to safer levels. The yellow-green gas emissions slowed and finally stopped as the chemical reactions were brought under control. The fire chief approached cautiously, his experienced eye noting the change in the situation. Is it over? Pamela checked the readings one more time, comparing the current values against the safe operating parameters she remembered from similar systems. The immediate crisis is over, she said, beginning to remove her protective gear. But this facility needs a complete safety inspection before it can resume operations. The cooling system failure that caused this problem indicates systemic maintenance issues that could lead to future incidents. Morrison sat down heavily on a nearby concrete barrier, his head in his hands as the full magnitude of what had almost happened sank in. I almost killed half the town, he said quietly. The important thing is that you didn't, Pamela said gently, her anger at his earlier arrogance tempered by recognition of his genuine distress. But this could have been prevented with proper safety protocols and regular maintenance. Over the next several hours, as hazmat specialists arrived from the state capitol and began their own assessment, Pamela found herself in the unusual position of briefing professional emergency responders on the technical details of what had happened. The neutralization was textbook perfect, said Dr. James Liu, the lead hazmat specialist. The timing and flow rates were exactly what I would have recommended, maybe better. How long have you been working in industrial chemistry? I haven't worked in the field for 3 years, Pamela said. I run a barber shop in town now. Dr. Liu looked at her with the same expression Morrison had worn earlier. Complete disbelief followed by grudging respect. Well, he said finally, that's some barber shop. Word of what had happened spread through Millbrook with the speed that only small-town news could achieve. By evening, everyone knew that the local barber had prevented what could have been a major chemical disaster. The story grew in the telling, as small-town stories do, but the core facts remained unchanged. Expertise had been hidden in plain sight, and assumptions about competence had nearly led to tragedy. Morrison found Pamela at her shop the next morning. He looked like he hadn't slept, and his expensive suit had been replaced with simple clothes that suggested a night spent reconsidering many things. The arrogant corporate executive was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely humbled by his experience. "I owe you an apology," he said simply, standing in the doorway of her shop like a penitent seeking absolution. Several apologies, actually. Pamela looked up from sweeping her shop floor, a routine task that helped her process the events of the previous day. "You were doing what you thought was best for your company." "No," Morrison said firmly, stepping into the shop and closing the door behind him. "I was being an arrogant fool who almost got people killed because I was too proud to listen. I dismissed you. I dismissed your neighbors. I dismissed anyone who didn't fit my narrow definition of expertise." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that seemed to age him several years. "I've been thinking about all the warnings you tried to give us, all the signs we ignored. If I had listened to you weeks ago, yesterday never would have happened." "The important thing is that everyone is safe now," Pamela said, though her tone suggested she appreciated his acknowledgement of the mistakes that had been made. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the vintage barber chairs and antique equipment that had seemed so quaint and irrelevant just days before. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you really were? Why let people think you were just a barber?" Pamela leaned on her broom, considering the question. It was one she had asked herself many times over the past 3 years, particularly during moments when her technical knowledge could have been useful in community discussions. "I am just a barber," she said finally. "That's what I chose to be when I came to Millbrook. My past experience happened to be useful yesterday, but it doesn't change what I do today or who I've become." "But you could have any job you wanted," Morrison pressed. "Chemical companies would pay you a fortune for your expertise. You could be designing safety systems, preventing incidents like this from happening anywhere." "I tried that life already," Pamela said with a small smile. "It wasn't for me. I like cutting hair. I like listening to people's stories. I like the peace of this town and the connections I've made here." Morrison nodded slowly, beginning to understand something he had never considered before. "I've been offered a transfer to another facility," he said. "I think I'm going to take it. This place deserves better management than I provided." "This place deserves management that respects the people who live here," Pamela said. "Your replacement might remember that expertise comes in many forms and that the most important knowledge often comes from unexpected sources." The next week, the Millbrook Gazette ran a front-page story about the chemical plant incident. The headline read, "Local Barber Saves Town with Hidden Expertise." The article detailed not just the technical aspects of the crisis, but the broader questions it raised about assumptions and expertise. Tom Rodriguez was the first customer in her chair after the newspaper came out, carrying a copy of the paper and grinning from ear to ear. "So, Dr. Wright," he said with obvious pride in his friend's accomplishment, "does this mean my haircuts are going to cost more now?" Pamela laughed, the sound carrying a lightness that had been missing since the crisis. "Same price as always, Tom. But I might be able to help if you ever have any chemistry questions." "Actually," Tom said, his expression turning serious, "I do have a question. Why stay in Millbrook? Why keep cutting hair when you could be solving big problems for big companies?" Pamela considered the question as she worked, her scissors moving with the same precision she had once applied to chemical equations. "Tom, yesterday I solved a big problem for this community. I used skills I learned in my previous career to help people I care about. That's more rewarding than any corporate job I ever had. But don't you miss the challenge? The complexity?" "Every person who sits in this chair has a story, Tom. Every conversation teaches me something new. Every day, I make people feel a little better about themselves. That's challenging in its own way, and it's more meaningful than optimizing chemical processes for companies that only care about profit margins. Tom nodded appreciatively. I never thought about it like that. The State Environmental Agency's investigation revealed extensive safety violations at the Peterson plant, many of which had been implemented to cut costs since Morrison's arrival. The facility was shut down for 6 months while comprehensive repairs and upgrades were completed. The investigation report, when it was finally released, painted a damning picture of corporate negligence and regulatory failure. According to the findings, Morrison had eliminated redundant safety systems, reduced maintenance schedules, and ignored multiple warnings from experienced workers. The thermal runaway that nearly caused a catastrophic release had been entirely preventable with proper equipment maintenance and monitoring. When the plant reopened, it was under new management that prioritized safety and community relations. The new manager, Sarah Kim, was a chemical engineer with 20 years of experience in industrial safety. Her first action was to meet with community leaders and establish open communication channels. "Dr. Wright," she said when she visited the barbershop during her first week in town, "I've read the reports about what happened here. I want you to know that we take community safety very seriously." "I'm glad to hear that," Pamela said, noting that Kim used her academic title respectfully rather than dismissively. "And it's just Pamela, or Miss Wright if you prefer. I'm a barber, not a doctor." Sarah smiled, understanding the distinction Pamela was making. "Would you be willing to serve on our community advisory board? We're creating a panel of local residents to provide input on our operations." "I'd be honored," Pamela said. "But I think you should know that I'm just a local business owner. My technical background isn't really relevant to my current life." "Actually, I think it's exactly relevant," Sarah said. "You understand both the technical aspects of what we do and the concerns of the community we serve. That combination is exactly what we need." Pamela agreed to serve on the advisory board, where her unique perspective proved valuable in bridging the gap between technical operations and community concerns. The meetings were held monthly in the town hall, and they quickly became a model for other communities dealing with industrial facilities. During one early meeting, a concerned parent asked about air quality monitoring. Sarah Kim began explaining the technical details of emission controls, but Pamela intervened. "Let me translate that," Pamela said with a gentle smile. "What Sarah is saying is that the plant monitors the air continuously, like having a smoke detector that never sleeps. If anything unusual is detected, alarms go off and systems shut down automatically." The parent nodded, clearly understanding the analogy in a way that the technical explanation hadn't conveyed. This became Pamela's unofficial role on the board, helping community members understand complex technical information and helping plant management understand community concerns. Morrison's replacement at the corporate level lasted only 3 months before he too was transferred. The parent company, facing potential lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny, eventually sold the facility to a regional firm that prioritized long-term stability over short-term profits. Meanwhile, Pamela's barbershop became something of a local landmark. Visitors to Millbrook often stopped by to meet the barber who had saved the town, though Pamela always redirected the conversation to the importance of community cooperation and listening to each other. "The real story," she would tell visitors, "isn't about one person's technical knowledge. It's about what happens when communities value everyone's contributions, and when people are willing to listen to each other regardless of job titles or social status." One afternoon, a group of high school students working on a science project came to interview her. They had read about the incident in their chemistry class and wanted to understand how scientific knowledge applied to real-world situations. "Miss Wright," one of them asked, "do you ever regret giving up your career as a scientist?" Pamela thought for a moment while she cleaned her tools, considering how to explain a decision that had seemed so clear to her but might not make sense to young people just starting to think about careers. "I didn't give up being a scientist," she said finally. "I just changed how I apply scientific thinking. When I listen to customers, I'm gathering data. When I solve their problems, whether it's a difficult haircut or helping them work through personal issues, I'm still using analytical skills." "But don't you miss the important work?" another student asked, echoing the assumption that corporate research was inherently more valuable than service work. "What makes you think cutting hair isn't important work?" Pamela asked gently. "When Mr. Johnson comes in before his job interviews, I help him feel confident. When Mrs. Patterson comes in after her chemotherapy treatments, I help her feel beautiful again. When teenagers come in nervous about prom, I help them feel special. That's important work." The students exchanged glances, clearly reconsidering their assumptions about the relative value of different types of work. "Besides," Pamela added with a smile, "sometimes a barber gets to save a town from chemical disaster. You never know when your past experience might be useful." News of the incident had reached beyond Millbrook, and Pamela occasionally received calls from chemical companies offering lucrative positions. Headhunters would call, promising six-figure salaries and the chance to work on cutting-edge projects. She politely declined them all. "The corporate world will always be there if I decide I want to return," she told Tom during one of his regular appointments. "But this community, these relationships, this life I've built, that's not something I want to trade away." "Even for millions of dollars?" Tom asked, incredulous at the idea of turning down such opportunities. "Tom, I have everything I need: a home I love, work that satisfies me, and friends who value me for who I am, not what degrees I have or what salary I could command. That's worth more than money." Dr. Liu, the hazmat specialist who had worked the chemical incident, became a regular correspondent. He was writing a case study about the crisis response and wanted to include Pamela's perspective on emergency management in small communities. "Your approach to the neutralization was innovative," he wrote in one email. "Most professionals would have followed standard protocols, which might not have been fast enough given the rate of temperature increase. Your background in both theoretical chemistry and practical application allowed for a creative solution." Pamela wrote back, "I think the key was that I wasn't trying to follow a textbook. I was just trying to solve a problem for my neighbors. Sometimes the best technical solutions come from clear thinking and practical experience, rather than complex procedures." The case study was eventually published in the Journal of Emergency Response, with Pamela listed as co-author. It was the first academic publication she had contributed to in over 3 years, and she was surprised by how little she missed that world. The paper attracted attention from emergency management professionals and led to speaking invitations that Pamela mostly declined. She preferred to contribute to the field through her work on the Community Advisory Board rather than returning to academic conferences and professional symposiums. A year after the incident, Millbrook celebrated its annual Founders' Day festival. Pamela was asked to speak at the community gathering, though she tried to decline the honor. "I really don't think I deserve special recognition," she told Mayor Patricia Williams. "I just did what anyone with the right knowledge would have done." "That's exactly why you should speak," the mayor replied. "You remind us that heroism often comes from unexpected places, and that we should never underestimate each other." Pamela's speech was brief and focused on the importance of community cooperation, rather than individual heroism. "What happened at the chemical plant wasn't really about my technical background," she told the gathered crowd of several hundred people. "It was about people working together, listening to each other, and putting community safety above personal pride. Every one of you has knowledge and skills that could be crucial in the right situation. Don't let anyone convince you that your contribution isn't valuable. After the festival, many people approached her with stories of times they had been dismissed or underestimated because of their jobs or backgrounds. She listened to each one, offering encouragement and reminding them that expertise comes in many forms. Martha Stevens, the librarian, told her about solving a complex research problem for a graduate student who had assumed small-town librarians couldn't understand academic research. He needed historical documents about industrial development in rural areas, Martha explained. Spent weeks trying to find sources through university databases. I found everything he needed in our local archives in about an hour. Bill Harper, who ran the town's gas station, described how he had once diagnosed a car problem that stumped 3 different mechanics because his military experience had taught him to recognize the sound of specific engine failures. They kept looking at the engine, Bill said, but I knew from the sound that it was a transmission problem. 15 years as a helicopter mechanic teaches you to listen to machines. These conversations reinforced Pamela's belief that every person had valuable knowledge and that the key to a strong community was respecting and utilizing everyone's contributions. 2 years after the chemical incident, Morrison returned to Millbrook. He looked different, less polished, more genuine. His expensive suits had been replaced with practical clothes, and his demeanor suggested someone who had learned important lessons about humility and respect. He found Pamela at her barbershop on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the shop was empty, except for the familiar sounds of scissors and the gentle hum of the air conditioning. I was in the area and wanted to stop by, he said, seeming almost shy about the visit. I've been thinking a lot about what happened here. How have you been? Pamela asked, gesturing for him to sit in one of the customer chairs. Different, Morrison said with a rueful smile. I left the chemical industry entirely after what happened here. I'm working for a nonprofit now, helping communities develop emergency response plans for industrial accidents. That sounds like meaningful work. It is. And I owe that to you, in a way. What happened here taught me that real expertise often comes from unexpected sources. I spend a lot of time now listening to local residents, learning from their observations and concerns. Morrison was quiet for a moment, staring at his reflection in the barbershop mirror. I also wanted to apologize again, not just for how I treated you, but for how I treated this entire community. I was so focused on what I thought success looked like that I forgot about the people who could be affected by my decisions. We all make mistakes, Pamela said gently, her anger at his earlier arrogance long since replaced by understanding. The important thing is learning from them. Can I ask you something? Morrison said. Do you ever regret not staying in the chemical industry? You could have changed how companies approach safety, could have prevented other incidents like the one here. Pamela considered the question while she organized her tools, a routine that helped her think through complex issues. I think I'm making more of a difference here than I ever did in corporate America. Here, I'm part of a community. I know the people who could be affected by industrial decisions. That personal connection makes me more effective, not less. How so? When I was working for big companies, safety was often about following regulations and avoiding liability. Here, safety is about protecting my neighbors. That changes everything about how you approach problems. Morrison nodded slowly. I never thought about it that way. Before he left, Morrison asked if he could get a haircut. I haven't been to a real barbershop in years, he said. Corporate life is all about chain salons and quick services. I forgot what it was like to have someone take time with the details. As Pamela worked, they talked about their current lives, their changed perspectives, and the importance of community. Morrison left looking better than when he had arrived, and not just because of the haircut. The chemical plant continued to operate safely under its new management, and Pamela remained on the Community Advisory Board. Her contributions were valued not just for her technical knowledge, but for her ability to translate complex concepts into terms that residents could understand. Sarah Kim, the plant's current manager, often consulted with Pamela about community relations and safety communications. "You have a gift for explaining technical concepts without being condescending," Sarah told her during one of their meetings. "Most engineers either oversimplify to the point of being useless, or they use so much jargon that nobody understands them. I think it helps that I spend my days talking to people from all walks of life," Pamela said. "When you cut hair, you learn to communicate with farmers, teachers, students, retirees, everyone. That teaches you to adjust your language to your audience." The advisory board meetings became a model for other communities dealing with industrial facilities. Delegations visited from 3 other towns to learn about Millbrook's approach to community industry cooperation. During one such visit, a city councilman from a larger town asked Pamela, "How do you balance your role as a technical advisor with your identity as a local business owner?" "I don't balance them," Pamela replied. "They're the same thing. I'm a member of this community who happens to have specialized knowledge. That knowledge is just one tool I use to help my neighbors, the same way my scissors are a tool I use to help them look their best." The visitors were impressed by the genuine cooperation they observed between the plant management and community representatives. "Most places, there's an adversarial relationship," one visitor noted. "Here, it feels like everyone is working toward the same goals." "That's because we are," Pamela said. "We all want the plant to operate safely and successfully. We all want our community to thrive. When you start from shared values, cooperation comes naturally." On the 3rd anniversary of the chemical incident, the Millbrook Gazette published a follow-up story. The reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Park, interviewed several community members about the long-term impact of the crisis. "The biggest change isn't in our safety procedures," Tom Rodriguez told her. "It's in how we view each other. We learned not to make assumptions about what people are capable of." Martha Stevens agreed. "Pamela showed us that expertise can be hidden in plain sight. Now we listen more carefully to each other's ideas, regardless of what job someone has." When Jennifer interviewed Pamela, she asked about the lessons learned from the experience. "I think the most important lesson is that communities are stronger when they value all kinds of knowledge," Pamela said. "Technical expertise is important, but so is practical experience, local knowledge, and common sense. The best solutions usually come from combining different perspectives." "Do you think you would have handled the situation differently if you had still been working as a chemical engineer?" Pamela thought for a moment. "I might have been more focused on following established protocols rather than finding creative solutions. Working as a barber taught me to improvise, to work with what's available, to focus on practical results rather than theoretical perfection." "So your current job actually made you better at emergency response?" "My current job made me better at understanding what really matters," Pamela said. "When you spend your days listening to people talk about their hopes and fears, their families and challenges, you develop a different perspective on problem solving. You think about human impact first, technical elegance second." The anniversary article sparked interest from a national magazine, which sent a reporter to do a feature story about Pamela and Millbrook. The resulting piece, titled "The Barber Who Saved a Town," focused on themes of hidden expertise and community cooperation. The magazine story brought visitors from around the country to Millbrook, many of whom stopped by Pamela's barbershop. She welcomed them all politely, but always steered conversations away from herself and toward the community. "The real story isn't about me," she would tell visitors. It's about a town that learned to value everyone's contributions. I just happened to be in the right place with the right knowledge at the right time. One visitor, a professor from a nearby university, asked if she would consider speaking to his engineering students about the incident. "What would you want me to tell them?" Pamela asked. "That engineering is about more than technical knowledge," the professor said. "It's about understanding the human context of your work, about communicating with people who don't share your background, about being humble enough to learn from unexpected sources." Pamela agreed to speak to the class, where she emphasized the importance of listening and continuous learning. "I learned more about communication and problem solving in my first year as a barber than I did in 4 years of graduate school," she told the students. "Not because the technical education wasn't valuable, but because cutting hair taught me to pay attention to details I had never noticed before." "What kind of details?" one student asked. "How to read people's body language, how to adjust my approach based on someone's personality, how to solve problems with limited resources, how to make people feel comfortable when they're anxious. These are all engineering skills, even though you wouldn't learn them in a traditional engineering course." After her talk, several students approached her with questions about alternative career paths and the value of diverse experiences. "I always thought I had to work for a big company to make a difference," one student said. "But you're showing me that impact can happen anywhere." "The key is to match your skills with your values," Pamela replied. "I'm more effective as an engineer now than I ever was in corporate America because my work is aligned with what I care about most." As the years passed, Pamela's barbershop became an informal gathering place for the community. People would stop by not just for haircuts, but to discuss local issues, share news, and seek advice. The comfortable chairs she had added near the window became a place where people gathered to solve problems and support each other. Her unique combination of technical expertise and interpersonal skills made her a trusted voice on a wide range of topics. When the town council debated a new water treatment system, Pamela helped translate the technical specifications into terms residents could understand. When the school district considered a new science curriculum, she provided input on practical applications that would engage students. "You've become our unofficial community consultant," Mayor Williams observed during one of Pamela's regular haircuts. "I've become a neighbor who happens to have some useful knowledge," Pamela corrected gently. "The same way Tom knows everything about hardware, and Martha knows everything about research, and Bill knows everything about engines. We all contribute what we can." 5 years after the chemical incident, Millbrook had become something of a model community for industry resident cooperation. The town regularly hosted conferences and workshops on community engagement and emergency preparedness. Pamela was often asked to participate in these events, though she preferred to work behind the scenes, helping to organize rather than taking center stage. "I think the story is more powerful when it comes from the whole community," she told the organizers of one such conference. "People need to hear from Tom about how the hardware store became an emergency supply center, from Martha about how the library became an information hub, from the fire chief about how volunteers stepped up. My part was just one piece of a bigger puzzle." The conference was attended by representatives from dozens of communities facing similar challenges with industrial facilities. The attendees were impressed by the genuine cooperation they observed. Dr. Amanda Foster, a sociologist studying community resilience, conducted interviews with several Millbrook residents. "What's unusual here is the absence of the typical us versus them mentality between residents and industry," she noted in her research. "Instead, there's a shared commitment to mutual success." When Dr. Foster interviewed Pamela, she asked about the factors that contributed to this cooperation. "I think it started with the recognition that we all live here," Pamela said. "The plant managers, the workers, the business owners, we're all neighbors. When you approach problems from that perspective, you find common ground more easily." But surely there must be conflicts of interest, Dr. Foster pressed. Environmental concerns versus economic benefits, safety costs versus profitability. Of course there are tensions, Pamela agreed. But we've learned to address them through open communication rather than adversarial positions. When the plant proposed expanding their operations last year, instead of automatic opposition, we worked together to identify ways to grow responsibly. The expansion Dr. Foster mentioned had indeed been a test of the community's collaborative approach. The chemical plant wanted to add a new production line that would create jobs, but also increase environmental impact. Rather than battle over the proposal, the Community Advisory Board had worked with the company to redesign the expansion plan. They incorporated additional safety measures, environmental protections, and community benefits that satisfied both economic and environmental concerns. The final plan was better than what either side originally proposed, Sarah Kim explained to conference attendees. By working together from the beginning, we avoided the usual cycle of proposals, opposition, compromise, and resentment. Pamela's role in that process had been crucial, but typically, she downplayed her contribution. I just helped translate between different groups, she said when asked about her involvement. Engineers speak one language, environmentalists speak another, business owners speak a third. Sometimes you need someone who can understand all the languages. The success of the expansion project attracted attention from other communities and companies. Pamela began receiving requests to consult on similar projects in other towns. She accepted a few such invitations, always insisting that any solutions had to come from the communities themselves rather than being imposed from outside. Every place is different, she told a group of city planners in Ohio. What works in Millbrook might not work here, but the principles are the same. Listen to everyone, respect different kinds of expertise, focus on shared values rather than positions. Her consulting work was part-time and selective. She never wanted it to interfere with her primary identity as Millbrook's barber and community member. The barbershop keeps me grounded, she explained to a reporter who asked about balancing her various roles. When I'm cutting hair, listening to people's everyday concerns, I remember what really matters. That perspective makes me more effective in everything else I do. The barbershop itself had evolved over the years. What started as a simple haircutting business had become a community hub where people gathered to discuss local issues, share news, and seek informal advice. Pamela had added a small seating area with comfortable chairs and a coffee machine. Local newspapers and magazines were available, along with community bulletin boards and information about town events. It's like the old general store, observed Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s but still a regular customer. A place where you come for one thing but end up learning about everything else that's happening. Young people especially seemed drawn to the relaxed atmosphere. High school students would stop by after school, not always for haircuts, but sometimes just to talk through problems or get homework help. Miss Wright always has good advice, explained Jessica Martinez, a junior who was struggling with college applications. She helped me understand that there are lots of different paths to success, not just the obvious ones. Pamela had indeed become an informal mentor to many young people in the community. Her own unconventional career path made her particularly effective at helping students think beyond traditional expectations. I tell them the same thing I learned from my own experience, she said. Follow your interests, develop your skills, and stay open to unexpected opportunities. You never know when seemingly unrelated experiences will combine in useful ways. Carlos Thompson, a recent high school graduate, credited Pamela with helping him choose a college major. I was torn between engineering and education, he said. Miss Wright helped me realize I didn't have to choose. She showed me that you can use technical skills to serve your community in lots of different ways. Carlos eventually chose engineering with a minor in education, planning to work in public service or community development rather than traditional corporate roles. Stories like Carlos's were common in Millbrook. The community had developed a culture that valued diverse paths to contribution and success. Tom Rodriguez's daughter, Elena, had become a teacher after initially planning to leave Millbrook for a big city career. "I realized I could make more of a difference here," she said. "This town taught me that impact isn't about the size of your stage, it's about the depth of your commitment." Even former residents who had left for college or careers often returned to visit and seek advice from Pamela and other community members. Kevin Foster, who had grown up in Millbrook before becoming a successful software engineer in Silicon Valley, returned for his 10-year high school reunion with a new perspective. "I spent years thinking I had to choose between career success and community connection," he told Pamela during a visit to the barbershop. "But watching what you've built here, I'm wondering if there might be a way to combine both." Kevin eventually did find that combination, starting a technology company that employed remote workers from small towns across the Midwest, bringing good jobs to rural communities while maintaining the lifestyle and connections he valued. His company became one of several businesses that emerged from or relocated to Millbrook, drawn by the community's collaborative culture and quality of life. The town's economic development had been gradual and sustainable, avoiding the boom and bust cycles that affected many small communities. "We've grown carefully," Mayor Williams explained to a delegation from the State Economic Development Office. "Instead of chasing any business that would come here, we've focused on attracting organizations that share our values and want to be part of our community." The approach had worked well. Millbrook's population had grown by 30% over 5 years, but the character of the town remained intact. New residents often commented on the welcoming atmosphere and the sense that everyone's contributions were valued. "I moved here from Chicago expecting to find typical small-town insularity," said Dr. Rachel Green, who had opened a medical practice in Millbrook. "Instead, I found a community that was genuinely interested in new ideas and different perspectives." Dr. Green had been impressed by the informal mentoring network that seemed to operate throughout the town. "People here really invest in each other's success," she observed. "It's not unusual for someone to connect you with exactly the person you need to talk to, even if they don't benefit directly from the connection." This network had its roots in the relationships Pamela had built through her barbershop, but it had grown far beyond any single person or business. The town's culture of mutual support attracted attention from researchers studying community development and social capital. Professor Michael Hansen from the State University spent a semester in Millbrook studying what he called practical social innovation. "Most communities either resist change or embrace it without consideration for consequences," he wrote in his research report. Millbrook has developed a third approach: thoughtful adaptation that preserves core values while incorporating beneficial innovations. Professor Hansen's research identified several factors that contributed to Millbrook's success. Distributed leadership that wasn't concentrated in formal positions, informal mentoring networks that crossed generational and professional lines, and a culture that valued diverse forms of expertise. "What's remarkable is how this culture reproduces itself," he noted. "New residents and young people quickly absorb the community's values and begin contributing to its continued development." Pamela was mentioned in the research, but as one example among many of community members who had found ways to contribute beyond their formal roles. "The barber engineer is a compelling story," Professor Hansen wrote, "but she's not unique in this community. The hardware store owner who became an emergency coordinator, the librarian who became a research specialist, the mechanic who became a small business advisor. Millbrook is full of people who have expanded their impact beyond traditional job descriptions." When the research was published, it attracted attention from policymakers and community development specialists around the country. Millbrook began hosting regular visits from groups interested in learning about their approach to community development. These visits became a modest source of revenue for the town, with visitors staying in local hotels, eating at local restaurants, and sometimes returning for longer residencies or business investments. But the visits also reinforced the community's sense of its own success and unique character. It's gratifying to know that what we've built here has value beyond our own boundaries, Tom Rodriguez reflected during one of his haircuts with Pamela. But I hope we don't get so focused on being a model that we forget to keep growing and improving. Pamela nodded as she worked. The key is remembering that we didn't set out to create a model community. We just tried to solve problems and support each other. As long as we keep that focus, we'll be fine. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar visitor, David Morrison, making one of his now regular stops in Millbrook. Morrison had indeed built a successful career helping communities develop emergency response plans, and he credited his experience in Millbrook with teaching him how to listen to local residents and respect their expertise. "I probably learn more here than the communities I consult with," he told Pamela as he settled into the barber chair. "This place keeps me honest about what really matters." Morrison's visits had become something of a ritual. He would get a haircut, participate in whatever community activities were happening during his stay, and often give talks to local students about emergency management and community relations. His transformation from arrogant corporate manager to thoughtful community advocate had become part of Millbrook's story, another example of how the town seemed to bring out the best in people. "I tell students that my biggest professional success came from my biggest personal failure," Morrison said during one such talk. "Learning to listen, learning to admit what I didn't know, learning to value other people's perspectives. Those lessons saved my career and probably my life." After Morrison's visit, Pamela reflected on how much had changed since that first confrontation years ago. The chemical plant continued to operate safely and profitably. The community had grown and prospered while maintaining its character. People who had been adversaries had become collaborators and friends. Most importantly, the town had developed a culture of mutual respect and shared responsibility that seemed likely to endure beyond any individual contributions. "I think we've built something that's bigger than any of us," Pamela told Tom during one of their conversations. "Something that will keep working even as people come and go." "You really think it will last?" Tom asked. "I think the principles will last," Pamela said. "Listen to each other, respect different kinds of knowledge, focus on shared values, work together to solve problems. Those aren't complicated ideas, but they make a huge difference when people actually practice them." As she spoke, Pamela looked around her barbershop, at the comfortable chairs where people gathered to talk, at the bulletin boards full of community information, at the windows that looked out on a thriving Main Street. She thought about the path that had brought her here, from corporate laboratories to small-town barbershop, from individual achievement to community contribution, from hiding her expertise to finding new ways to use it. The journey hadn't been planned, but it had led to exactly where she belonged. 10 years after the chemical incident, Pamela received an unexpected phone call. It was from the president of her old university, asking if she would consider accepting an honorary doctorate and speaking at the commencement ceremony. "Dr. Wright," the president said, "your story has become something of a legend in our engineering program. You represent everything we hope our graduates will become: technically excellent, ethically grounded, and committed to serving their communities." Pamela was touched by the offer, but ultimately declined the honorary degree. "I appreciate the recognition," she told the president, "but I think the story would be more powerful if it came from a barber who happened to study engineering, rather than an engineer who happened to cut hair." Instead, she suggested that the university establish a scholarship program for students from small towns who wanted to return to their communities after graduation. The Millbrook Scholarship as it came to be known, would provide not just financial support, but mentoring from professionals who had found ways to combine technical expertise with community service. The first recipients of the scholarship visited Millbrook as part of their orientation. They spent a week learning about community engagement, meeting with local business owners and civic leaders, and understanding how technical knowledge could be applied to real-world problems. One of the students, a young woman studying environmental engineering, was fascinated by the Community Advisory Board model. "I want to work on water quality issues in rural areas," she told Pamela. "But I never thought about how to actually connect with communities and gain their trust." "The key," Pamela said, "is to remember that you're not bringing solutions to people who don't understand their own problems. You're bringing tools that communities can use to solve problems they've already identified." The scholarship program became another piece of Millbrook's legacy, a way for the community's approach to spread to other places through the young people who learned its principles. As Pamela entered her 50s, she began to think about succession planning for her barbershop. She had trained several young people over the years, but she wanted to make sure that whoever took over would understand the shop's role as more than just a place to get haircuts. Maria Santos, a young woman who had grown up in Millbrook and returned after studying business in college, expressed interest in taking over the shop eventually. "I don't just want to cut hair," Maria told Pamela. "I want to continue what you've built here. The community connections, the problem solving, the mentoring." Maria had no technical background like Pamela's, but she had other skills. Fluency in Spanish that helped her connect with the town's growing Latino population, social media expertise that could help the shop reach younger customers, and a natural gift for making people feel comfortable and valued. "Every generation brings different strengths," Pamela told her. "The important thing is maintaining the spirit of service and community connection." As Maria began taking on more responsibilities at the shop, Pamela found herself with more time for other pursuits. She started teaching a weekly science literacy class at the library, helping adults understand everything from climate change to medical research to food safety. "The goal isn't to make everyone a scientist," she explained to the first group of participants. "It's to help people ask good questions and evaluate information critically." The classes were popular with people from all walks of life: farmers wanting to understand soil chemistry, parents trying to make sense of vaccine research, retirees curious about new technologies. Pamela's teaching style was the same as her approach to everything else: respectful, patient, and focused on practical applications. She never talked down to people or assumed they couldn't understand complex concepts. "Everyone in this room has expertise in something," she would tell each new group. "My job is to help you apply the same thinking skills you use in your own field to scientific questions." The science literacy classes became so popular that Pamela had to add additional sessions to accommodate demand. People appreciated her ability to explain complex concepts without making them feel ignorant, and her willingness to admit when she didn't know something and research it together with the class. "Dr. Wright makes science feel accessible," said Robert Kim, a local farmer who attended the classes to better understand soil chemistry and sustainable agriculture. "She never makes you feel stupid for asking questions." One evening, after a particularly engaged discussion about renewable energy, an older woman named Dorothy Walsh approached Pamela with tears in her eyes. "I dropped out of high school 60 years ago to help support my family," Dorothy said. "I always thought science wasn't for people like me. Tonight was the first time I felt like I could understand these things." Moments like these reminded Pamela why she had chosen her unconventional path. In the corporate world, her expertise had been used to optimize processes and maximize profits. Here, it was helping people become more informed citizens, better parents, and more confident participants in an increasingly complex world. The town continued to evolve and grow, but always thoughtfully. When a major tech company expressed interest in building a data center near Millbrook, the community advisory process that had been developed for the chemical plant was adapted for this new challenge. Pamela found herself once again translating between technical experts and community members, helping people understand the environmental and economic implications of the proposed facility. The key questions, she told a packed town hall meeting, are about energy consumption, water usage, and long-term commitments to the community. We need to understand not just what this company is promising today, but what safeguards are in place to ensure those promises are kept over time. The tech company's representatives had initially been puzzled by the level of engagement and technical sophistication they encountered in a small town. They were accustomed to communities that either rejected development entirely or accepted it without questions. "This is the most thorough evaluation process we've experienced," the company's project manager told Pamela after one of the advisory meetings. "But it's also the most collaborative. Instead of fighting us, you're helping us design a better project." The final agreement included environmental protections, workforce development programs, and revenue-sharing arrangements that benefited both the company and the community. It became another model for how small towns could engage with large corporations as partners rather than supplicants. As Pamela's reputation grew, she was invited to serve on state-level advisory committees dealing with science education and community development. She accepted selected appointments, but always insisted that her primary commitment remained to Millbrook. "I've learned that you can have more impact by going deep in one place than by spreading yourself thin across many places," she explained to a governor's aide who tried to recruit her for a full-time state position. Her influence was felt in other ways, too. The engineering scholarship program had expanded to multiple universities, and several of the recipients had gone on to establish similar community-focused practices in their own hometowns. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, one of the first scholarship recipients, had become a water quality engineer working with rural communities across the Southwest. "Pamela taught me that technical expertise is only valuable if you can connect it to real human needs," Amanda said during a visit to Millbrook. "Every project I work on, I ask myself, am I solving a problem that communities have identified? Or am I imposing solutions they didn't ask for?" The scholarship program had also inspired similar initiatives at other institutions. The concept of training technically skilled professionals who were committed to community service was spreading, creating a network of engineers, scientists, and other professionals who saw their expertise as a tool for public service rather than just personal advancement. 15 years after the chemical incident, Pamela was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell her story. She agreed to participate, but insisted that the film focus on the community rather than her individual actions. The real story is about what happens when communities value everyone's knowledge and when people are willing to work together across professional and social boundaries, she told the filmmaker. The resulting documentary, Hidden in Plain Sight, featured not just Pamela, but dozens of Millbrook residents talking about their own expertise and contributions. It showed how the town had become a place where a farmer's knowledge of soil conditions was valued alongside an engineer's understanding of chemical processes, where a librarian's research skills were as respected as a doctor's medical training. The film premiered at several festivals and was eventually picked up by a streaming service, reaching audiences around the world. It sparked conversations about expertise, community, and the value of different types of knowledge. But perhaps more importantly, it inspired other communities to examine their own assumptions about who had valuable knowledge and whose voices deserved to be heard. Letters poured in from viewers who had recognized themselves or their communities in the film. A retired teacher in Ohio wrote about how she had started offering informal science tutoring after watching the film. A mechanic in Oregon described how he had begun sharing his diagnostic skills with local technical students. Your film helped me realize that my 30 years of fixing cars had taught me problem-solving skills that could be useful in other contexts, the mechanic wrote. I'm now working with the high school to develop a program that teaches analytical thinking through automotive diagnosis. These responses confirmed what Pamela had always believed. Expertise existed everywhere, in every community and every profession. The challenge wasn't creating more experts, it was recognizing and utilizing the expertise that already existed. As Pamela entered her 60s, she began to step back from some of her formal roles while remaining deeply engaged in community life. Maria Santos had fully taken over the barbershop, bringing her own innovations while maintaining the spirit of service and connection that Pamela had established. The shop now offered bilingual services and had become a gathering place for Millbrook's diverse community. Maria had added a small area where people could access free internet and computer services, recognizing that digital literacy was becoming as important as traditional literacy. Every generation has to adapt the model to meet current needs, Pamela observed, as she watched Maria help an elderly customer set up email to communicate with distant grandchildren. But the core principle remains the same. Use your skills to help your neighbors. Pamela's own focus shifted increasingly toward mentoring and teaching. She developed online courses that help technical professionals learn to communicate with general audiences, drawing on her years of experience, translating between different types of expertise. The biggest barrier to using technical knowledge for public good isn't the complexity of the science, she would tell her students. It's the failure to communicate in ways that respect people's intelligence while acknowledging their different backgrounds. Her courses attracted students from around the world, engineers working in international development, doctors trying to improve public health communication, researchers wanting to make their work more accessible to policymakers. The feedback was consistently positive, with students reporting that Pamela's approach had transformed not just their communication skills, but their entire perspective on their professional responsibilities. Dr. Wright taught me that being an expert means you have an obligation to share your knowledge in ways that empower others rather than intimidating them, wrote one student, a climate scientist working with coastal communities. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in late spring, Pamela sat in the comfortable chair by the window of what had been her barbershop, watching the familiar rhythm of small-town life unfold on Main Street. Children rode bicycles on the sidewalk, while parents chatted with neighbors. Teenagers gathered outside the ice cream shop, and elderly couples walked hand in hand toward the park. The scene was peaceful and ordinary, exactly what she had sought when she first came to Millbrook. But she knew that beneath the surface calm lay something extraordinary. A community that had learned to value everyone's contributions, to listen to different perspectives, and to work together to solve problems. Maria emerged from the back of the shop carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling into the chair beside Pamela. "Just thinking about how far we've all come," Pamela said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "When I first moved here, I thought I was running away from my old life. Now I realize I was running towards something I didn't even know I needed." "Any regrets?" Maria asked. Pamela considered the question seriously. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had stayed in corporate life, tried to change things from the inside. But then I think about all the people here who have been touched by what we've built, all the young people who have been inspired to think differently about service and community." She gestured toward the window, where they could see several of the scholarship recipients who had returned to Millbrook for a reunion gathering. "I think I've had more impact here than I ever could have had in a corporate laboratory." As evening approached, Pamela walked home through streets that had become as familiar as breathing. She passed the chemical plant, now operating safely under community oversight. She passed the library where Martha Stevens still worked, though she was training her own replacement. She passed Tom Rodriguez's hardware store, now run by his son, but still serving as an informal community center. At home, Pamela opened her laptop and began working on her latest project, a book about community engagement and technical expertise. The manuscript was nearly finished, representing years of reflection on her experiences and observations. The book wasn't an autobiography, but rather a practical guide for communities and professionals who wanted to build more collaborative relationships. It included case studies from Millbrook and other communities, templates for advisory processes, and strategies for recognizing and utilizing local expertise. The goal, she had written in the introduction, is not to turn everyone into experts, but to create systems where different types of expertise can be combined effectively. The farmer who understands local soil conditions, the mechanic who can diagnose complex problems by sound, the teacher who knows how to explain difficult concepts, these are all forms of expertise that have value in community decision-making. The publisher had expressed confidence that the book would find a wide audience among community development professionals, technical experts working in public service, and citizen activists who wanted to be more effective in their advocacy. But Pamela's real hope was that it would inspire more communities to examine their own resources and develop their own models for collaboration and mutual support. As she wrote, she thought about the young people she had mentored over the years, the communities that had visited Millbrook to learn about their approach, the professionals who had been inspired to think differently about their responsibilities to society. The ripple effects of one small town's experiment in valuing everyone's contributions were spreading far beyond what she had ever imagined possible. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, Pamela reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. From the corporate laboratories where she had once designed chemical processes to the barber shop where she had learned to cut hair and listen to stories, every experience had contributed to her understanding of how technical knowledge could serve human needs. The chemical crisis that had revealed her true identity had been a moment of drama, but the real heroism had been in the quiet work of building relationships, fostering understanding, and creating systems that valued everyone's contributions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve her community. There would be more students to mentor, more problems to solve, more bridges to build between different types of knowledge and different ways of understanding the world. But tonight, Pamela was content to know that she had found her place in the world and had helped others find theirs as well. The barbershop might have been where her public story began, but the real story was in the lives that had been changed and the communities that had been strengthened by the simple recognition that expertise comes in many forms. Outside her window, Millbrook slept peacefully under a canopy of stars. The town had grown and changed over the years, but it had never lost its fundamental character, a place where people looked out for each other, where everyone's contributions were valued, and where the quiet work of community building continued day by day. In the morning, the sun would rise again over Main Street, painting golden streaks across the windows of the barber shop, where Maria would unlock the door and welcome the first customers of the day. The work would continue, carried forward by new hands, but guided by the same principles that had transformed a small town and inspired a movement. And somewhere in that ordinary morning routine lay the extraordinary truth that Pamela had discovered: that the greatest heroism often comes not from dramatic gestures or public recognition, but from the choice to use whatever gifts you have been given in service of others, one person, one problem, one act of service at a time. The barber's secret had long since ceased to be secret, but the lesson it taught, that everyone has something valuable to contribute, and that communities thrive when they recognize and nurture those contributions, continued to resonate far beyond the boundaries of one small town. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all. that true expertise isn't about having all the answers, but about knowing how to ask the right questions and having the wisdom to listen to the answers that come from unexpected sources. The ghost in maintenance coveralls had found her home, and in doing so, had helped an entire community discover what was possible when people looked beyond job titles and recognized the expertise that existed all around them, waiting to be valued, waiting to be heard, waiting to make a difference in the world. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.